who committed these crimes? Which individuals at Purdue committed those crimes? Mr. Landau.
Thank you for the question, Chairperson Maloney. You're correct. The company pled guilty in U.S. District Court to 3 felonies for specific crimes it committed during a specific period. And we're taking full accountability and responsibility for those crimes. We have over $8 billion of fines and penalties issued to us. We have a commitment for ongoing cooperation with the Department of Justice and a commitment to create a public repository for all documents deemed relevant so that the American people can see for themselves what did or did not occur.
Thank you, but that's not the question I asked. I asked who committed the crimes. We know that there were crimes. Who committed them? All kinds of crimes. And I'm sorry, you're the CEO of the company, and you pleaded guilty to crimes, and you're now telling me by not answering the question that you don't know who actually committed those crimes. If you don't know who committed those crimes, then you can't be sure that they're no longer working for Purdue. Will you at least commit to getting the names of the people who committed these crimes to the committee? After you talk to your lawyers, crimes were committed. Who did them? Who are the ones that bribed doctors and pharmacies? Who are the ones that conspired to defraud the U.S. government? Who are the ones that misbranded OxyContin and said it was safe when it's not, that it can kill people, as we've heard from our witnesses? So if you could talk to your lawyers and get that information. So to sum it up, the Sackler family made billions of dollars by fueling an opioid crisis, over $35 billion, that has claimed the lives of thousands and thousands of Americans and has caused an enormous amount of pain for families across the country. In light of all of this, Mr. Sackler and Dr. Sackler, I'd like to ask you one final question. And I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Sackler. Will you apologize to the American people for the role you played in the opioid crisis, Dr. Sackler?
I would be happy to apologize to the American people for all of the pain they've suffered and for the tragedies that they've experienced in their families. And I thought I did that earlier in my opening comments. That was my intention. I also am very angry. I'm angry that some people working at Purdue broke the law. I'm angry about it from 2007, and I'm angry about it now, again, in 2020. I think that...
I know you're angry, and I'm sorry, but that's not the apology we were looking for. You apologize for the pain people have suffered, but you've never apologized for the role that you played in the opioid crisis. So I'll ask you again, will you apologize for the role you played in the opioid crisis?
I have struggled with that question. I have asked myself over many years. I have tried to figure out, is there anything that I could have done differently, knowing what I knew then, not what I know now? And I have to say, there's nothing that I can find that I would have done differently based on what I believed and understood then, and what I learned from management and the reports to the board, and what I learned from my colleagues on the board. And it is extremely distressing. And it's...
And Mr. Sackler, will you apologize for the role that you played in the opioid crisis?
Well, I echo much of what my cousin said, but I will say to the American people, I am deeply and profoundly sorry that OxyContin has played a role in any addiction and death. While I believe I conducted myself legally and ethically, and I believe the full record will demonstrate that, I still feel absolutely terrible that a product created to help that has helped so many people has also been associated with death and addiction.
Well, I know I've gone way over my time, so I want to give the same amount of time, if not more, to Ranking Member Comer, but he wants to go last. So I will now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss, you are now recognized for questions. Mr. Heiss.
Oh, okay. Go to Mr. Grossman.
We seem to have technical problems. Mr. Glenn Grothman, I now recognize you.
There, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'll start out with Dr. Landau. What type of marketing strategies did Purdue utilize to increase sales of OxyContin?
Sorry, I was on mute. Representative, for the period up to becoming CEO in 2017, I was responsible for research and development, clinical development, developing new medicines. I wasn't responsible for sales and marketing and had no underlying expertise. So
You guys remember any bonuses paid to sales representatives for promoting? Okay, we are told here that people are getting up to 240 grand to sales reps to encourage more prescribing of OxyContin. Is that accurate?
I don't know that I could answer the question because that wasn't my area of responsibility. I apologize.
Okay, does David know the answer to that question?
Sorry, is that directed towards me?
Yeah.
Congressman? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Good grief. Do you know what time Purdue learned of the highly addictive nature of OxyContin?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard you correctly. Can you repeat?
At what time did Purdue, what year about did you learn that OxyContin was highly addictive?
I think the highly addictive nature or the addictive nature of opioids is something we've known, doctors and patients and Purdue has known since the beginning of the use of opioids millennia ago.
Okay. Could you tell us the increase in the number of OxyContin, say, prescribed between, say, when was it first marketed? OxyContin.
It was approved in 1995, but most people, I believe, would draw the launch as 1996.
Okay. Was there an increase in the amount of OxyContin prescribed between, say, the year 2000 and 2010?
No. In aggregate, OxyContin prescriptions, I believe, peaked in 2003. So if you're picking 2000 to 2010, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I believe prescriptions would have been down over that period.
Well, I will say from 2000 to 2003, was there a significant increase?
I'm not sure how significant the increase was. I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Okay. Could you tell us approximately the amount of OxyContin, say in the peak years, the early 2000s, the amount of OxyContin prescribed per capita in the United States compared to, say, Europe or Canada?
Well, I'm not sure that I can do that because I don't recall the years OxyContin was approved in those various markets. So I'm not sure I can draw that comparison.
Was it significantly more prescribed in the United States than other Western countries?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, Purdue versus the other Western countries, Purdue introduced OxyContin, other countries introduced it later, but also other opioids So it's not an easy comparison. I believe the answer that you're looking for is that yes, the United States as a whole is the largest consumer of opioids writ large in the world.
Okay. Did that ever hit you as unusual or kind of alarms should be going off or why so many more opioids were prescribed in the United States than other countries?
Well, it struck us definitely that there was a discrepancy. However, I think it's worth keeping in mind OxyContin was a very small percentage of U.S. prescriptions and is designed for a very small subset of patients. So while the United States leads the world in opioid prescribing, the overwhelming majority of that is immediate release opioids. OxyContin represented just a tiny fraction.
Do you know how many people were dying, say, of opioid overdoses in this country in the early 2000s?
I don't know that data. I know the current numbers.
Tens of thousands, right?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Do you feel any guilt for that? I mean, I'll put it this way. Even 15 years ago, I think there was anecdotal evidence out there, just average persons talking to each other. They were amazed the amount of opioids being prescribed by healthcare professionals. Okay. Were you of that or did you hear stories about that?
Well, we became aware of OxyContin. If you're asking about OxyContin in specific, we became aware of widespread abuse of OxyContin, and I believe 2000, 2001 time period as it became reported upon in the press.
Okay. Obviously, we get a lot of briefing here for this today. And a lot of it seems to focus on the massive amount of money that Purdue made selling OxyContin. Do you know, could you guess how much? I think there's a high markup on pharmaceuticals. Can you guess how much money Purdue made or your family made selling OxyContin?
I don't know the exact number, so I wouldn't hazard a guess. I do know the distributions.
Yeah, guess wildly.
I would guess Purdue. Well, what do you mean by made? Profit or revenue?
Well, we'll say both. We'll get both.
Okay. My guess is Purdue's revenue. What I've seen reported is around $30 billion of revenue. And my guess for profit is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of, before taxes, probably about half of that.
Okay, so maybe after taxes, probably over $10 billion.
No, I'm sorry, sir. The taxes are significantly higher. It's not a corporate. It's not a corporation.
Okay, I mean, well, you said profit being about 15. Okay, can be significantly higher, maybe a little bit less than that. Okay, you say you're sorry for what happened, and obviously thousands of people have died, tens of thousands of people have died, I think, because of the overselling or over marketing of OxyContin. It's become kind of a trendy thing among the billionaires of the country, at least among a few of them, to say that they're going to give back even all of their wealth by the time they die. Does your family, have they considered giving back significant segments of this, whatever it is, 12 or 13 billion dollars to charity of some nature? Do you feel these gains were ill-gotten? I guess I'll put it that way.
Well, if you'll permit me, I'd like to answer your first question because I think it's important to gain an understanding of the settlement process that's ongoing. And it's our belief that the settlement that the family has proposed represents more than the family ever received during the sale of OxyContin. So I think, in our opinion, sir, the answer is yes. We are in settlement negotiations to hopefully conclude at doing what you're suggesting.
What percentage of sales was OxyContin for Purdue Pharma, say at the high water mark, say in the year 2000? What percent
The
of,
gentleman's time has expired, but the gentleman, Mr. Sackler, may answer the question.
It was quite a large percentage. I believe around 90%.
wow, very interesting. Thank you for giving me some extra time, Madam Chairman.
Thank you for your question. The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Representative Norton, is recognized. Representative Norton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate very much this hearing. You've delayed it in order to make it as fair as possible. And I certainly appreciate the members of the family who are here. And I'm going to want to focus on other families. I want to focus on the families who've been victimized by OxyContin. Mr. Sackler, for the last 20 years, if we look back, we find almost 500,000 Americans have lost their lives from opioid or overdoses. And of course, your family has expressed empathy for them. I have an exchange from a 2001 email obtained by the Connecticut Attorney General, who was an acquaintance of your father's, who wrote, rather, an acquaintance of your father's wrote to your father, and here I'm quoting, "Abusers die. Well, that is the choice they made. I doubt a single one didn't know the risks." Mr. Sackler, your father responded, "Abusers aren't victims. They are the victimizers," end quote. Now, does your family still believe that people with addiction are victimizers?
No, not in any way. I know my father has apologized for that comment and comments like it in the past. And I know in the 20 years since that email, roughly 20 years since that email was written, I believe his views on abuse and addiction have changed significantly.
I very much appreciate that correction of his views then. The chair, sorry, somebody needs to mute in here. The chair indicated in her remarks earlier that we had received letters from dozens of people all over the country, and I'd really like to focus on these people. For example, we began this hearing appropriately with video from people who had, in fact, been victims of the opioid crisis. We have a letter from a mother in North Carolina whose who lost her child, 20 years old, hasn't recovered yet. She said, the pain is too intense. It's more than I can bear. I have trouble finding a will to live and carry on every single day. The committee has another letter from a man in Colorado whose brother first took OxyContin when he was simply getting his teeth removed. He said it didn't take long to discover he could get it anywhere. He could get it in a bar. It was just not hard to get. The man's brother died. He said he had been very quiet about it, but it isn't easy to stay quiet any longer. This person created a map for families to share their stories of loved ones grappling with addiction, and more than 2,500 stories have been posted on his map. People come to that map to post their stories. Mr. Sackler, I'd like your personal response to I wanted to lay out these stories we've been receiving. And I'd like your personal response to these stories. Do they indicate to you that you feel remorse? How would you respond to them in your own words? I can't hear it. He's muted.
I'm sorry. I feel tremendous empathy, sorrow, and remorse that a product like OxyContin that was produced to help people, and I believe has helped millions of people, has also been associated with stories like you're telling. I feel incredibly sorry for that. And I know our entire family does as well.
Madam Chair, I thought it was important to let the families speak for themselves and to hear from the Sackler family, Mr. Sackler in this case, a personal apology going to individual families. And I thank you and yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Armstrong, you are now recognized for question. Mr.
Thank you.
Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2007 Department of Justice concluded a prosecution on Purdue Pharma, pled guilty to 5 years probation, $634.5 million in fines. Mr. Sackler, approximately in 2007, what was the sale? What was the number of sales for OxyContin?
I don't remember the exact
It's
sales.
about $1 billion. Do you know what happened to the sales of OxyContin after you pled guilty in federal court?
I believe that
2008, 2.2 billion. 2009, just under 3 billion. 2010, over 3 billion. 2011, under 3 billion. 2012, about 2.7 billion. 2013, 2.6. 2014, 2.4. Ms. Sackler, you wanted to ask what you could have done differently? Look at your own damn balance sheet. The day after the year after you pled guilty, you say you didn't know what was going on. You knew what had happened. And pursuant to a bankruptcy audit from 1995 to 2007, you withdrew $1.3 billion from Purdue Pharma. You just testified that about 90% of your profit out of Purdue Pharma was from OxyContin. Do you know the number you withdrew from 2008 to 2018, Mr. Sackler, as a family?
I believe it's approximately $10 billion.
It's about $10.7 billion. 90% of that was related to OxyContin?
I believe that's approximately right. And of that money, about half was paid in taxes.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. We as people who fund the government from taxpayer, we really do appreciate that. So my question is, do you have cable?
I do have cable, yes.
Do you get newspapers?
No, I don't receive subscriptions to newspapers. I get my news.
Well, I was practicing criminal defense at the time all of this was going on, and I wish we could have every one of these companies in here at every different way. But I think it goes beyond the pale of believability to think that after settling with the federal government in 2007, you can honestly say, watching the sales of your own company's drugs, that you didn't know a problem was coming down the pipe. And to say that is just deprives believability and is absolutely abhorrent and appalling to the victims of opioid addiction. We have went through this. We've watched this happen. We've watched it happen in our communities. We've watched it happen from one end to the other. And I have no doubt in my mind that there were people within your company doing things differently. But I also have no doubt in my mind, just by looking at your own balance sheet, that you think claiming plausible deniability to any of this makes any sense whatsoever. And the last thing I would just say before I yield back is that as we continue to move through this and as we continue to do this, you know who benefits the best from these remote hearings? The witnesses, because we don't get the coverage we should, and we don't get the way this should be. And I agree we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I agree these things are difficult, but when we have technical difficulties, these are the exact kind of hearings that the American people need to hear about. Congress's opinion is at an all-time low, and rightfully so in my opinion, but we actually serve a very important purpose, and one of it is to hold people accountable. If one of my clients would have sold 5 pills of OxyContin on the street and got tied up in federal court, you know what their criminal penalty is? It's a 10-year minimum mandatory sentence in federal court. And in these opening statements, we get vigorously defend about everything. We defend any wrongdoing, but you all have pled guilty 4 times in federal court, once in 2007 and 3 times in 2020. And at least acknowledging that either in your testimony or opening statement would have been, I think, relevant, important, and probably given you more credibility with me and the rest of the committee. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper. You are now recognized, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper. I can't hear you. Can you unmute, Mr.
Can you hear?
Cooper? Now we can hear.
Thank you, Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Sackler, I'd like to ask you some questions about you and your family's involvement in the management of Purdue on the board of directors. According to the DOJ, Department of Justice, they said the named Sacklers as members of the Purdue board exercised substantial oversight over Purdue management. Mr. Sackler, isn't it correct that up until 2018, the Sackler family always had a majority of the board seats at Purdue?
I believe that's true, yes.
So you, as a family, made decisions about all aspects of Purdue, marketing, budgets, financial distributions, didn't you, as a family?
With the help of qualified outside directors and management.
But you had the board seats, the votes to do it. And you served on the board, I understand it, from 2012 to 2018. So you personally exercised substantial influence over the board.
There was a large board, and there were a large number of directors and a split board structure. So I don't know what you mean by me personally influencing things. I don't think I would agree with that.
I think Upton Sinclair once wrote that a man has difficulty understanding something if his salary depends on his not understanding. Let's move on to Dr. Landau. Dr. Landau, according to documents obtained by the Massachusetts Attorney General in 2017, you wrote that Purdue operated with, quote, the board of directors serving as the de facto CEO. Is that correct, Dr. Landau?
Representative, my comment regarding the board acting as de facto CEO was a consequence of the Sacklers owning many pharmaceutical companies around the world and the absence of an appointed global position to look out over all of them. So by default, the governance body was the board of directors for each of the companies, including, but not limited to, the U.S.
And it's the same Sackler family that is refusing to admit personal liability and culpability here. The company has pled guilty, as I understand it, but not individual members of the Sackler family. Dr. Landau, with outside consultants like McKinsey, it's my impression that they wrote as far back as 2008 that in the U.S., the board of Purdue Pharma is involved in all levels of decision-making in the company on a weekly basis. Another McKinsey consultant wrote, quote, the brothers, the Sackler brothers, who started the company, viewed all employees like the guys who trim the hedges. Employees should do exactly what's asked of them and not say too much. This consultant further noted that Purdue said, as a manager, you get rewarded for pandering to the board. Mr. Sackler, does that ring true with you?
No, it does not.
It's apparently referring to your father and his brothers.
My father only had one brother who's deceased. If you're referring to my grandfather, I can. My belief is he would have been horribly offended by that comment and viewed people who worked for him as valuable, imbued with a great deal of autonomy. And I knowing the people within the organization, I don't think they would agree with that either, like Mr. Landau.
So you paid McKinsey's fine, hefty fees for them not telling the truth?
Well, I wasn't a part of that McKinsey engagement. That was done by management. And McKinsey can express whatever opinion they want. That doesn't necessarily make it the truth.
Watching this hearing has been difficult. First, hearing the testimony of the victims of your drugs. And I know that we all are looking for a good solution to pain relief. But folks like Anna Lemke, Lemke, an addiction specialist at Stanford University, wrote a book way back in 2016 called The Drug Dealer MD that pointed out a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in the hearing today. Do you know if any members of the board of directors read Dr. Anna Lemke's book or were aware of that book?
I don't know if any members of the board of directors read a specific book. No,
Have you read it?
I have not read it.
I used to teach health policy at Vanderbilt Business School, and I required all of my students to read it. So perhaps the students at Vanderbilt were ahead of the board of directors at Purdue. Because again, if you're not interested in discovering the truth, and if your salary depends on your not understanding the truth, then you're not going to pursue the truth.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman may answer his question.
I'm sorry, I didn't take that as a question. Can you rephrase it, please, Congressman?
Let me conclude by saying, watching you testify makes my blood boil. I'm not sure that I'm aware of any family in America that's more evil than yours. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Higgins.
Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing. Dr. Landau, just to advise you, I'm going to be directing questions to you. And I thank you for your military service. Dr. Landau, if you're there, we have technical challenges. Have you ever ingested OxyContin?
I'm sorry, Representative. Did you ask me if I ever adjusted OxyContin?
Ingested.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Have you ever ingested OxyContin?
No, sir.
If you, as a soldier in theater and as a doctor, have you personally been around your fellow man that's suffering extreme pain, traumatic pain?
Representative, sadly, I have. I treated patients, as I mentioned in my oral testimony.
Understood. It's quite an intimate interaction, is it not, when you're trying to help someone that's in incredible pain? And in your opinion, what would that person do to make that pain end at that moment?
Well, I believe I understand what you're asking, and pain can be so severe to drive people to do many different things, sometimes extreme.
Well, the answer, I believe, it's not a complicated, it's not a trick question. The answer is, if you're in extreme pain and sufferable pain, you'll do almost anything to end that pain. You will certainly ingest a painkiller, and that, what I'd like to get at during my brief time of questioning is some contradictions regarding OxyContin as it was understood to be developed as a very effective pain medication to be used, obviously, according to prescription, but it quickly became. Listen, I was a police officer, a street cop for 12 years, full-time civilian. I was an MP in the Army, but beginning in 2004, I was a full-time civilian police officer. And most of the world, most of America came to know what OxyContin was in 2003 when Rush Limbaugh went through his addiction period, and to his credit, courageously and candidly admitted it on the air and went into treatment. And prior to that, OxyContin, and unless you were directly involved in it with pain management, America didn't really hear about it. But if you think about the timing becoming a full-time police officer, street cop, SWAT cop in 2004 until I decided to run for Congress in 2016. That was a period of time that America really went through opioid addiction, in incredible numbers of increase in addiction, heavy impact in communities across the country. And Oxy, Dr. Landau, Oxy was known to be so addictive, it was known on the street that it was just, cops get injured all the time. And we would know, generally speaking, I'm sure you could find exceptions, but if we got injured, we wouldn't take Oxy, because we know it was known, it had a reputation as a one-dose addiction. Now, my point is, if you're in extreme pain, you've acknowledged this, we find ways through modern pharmaceuticals to manage that pain and deal with it. But Oxy was so powerful and so addictive, regardless of how effective it was, it's not arguable, it was so addictive. The street knew that it was a serious problem, and yet, this is my question to you. How on earth did Purdue decide to pursue this policy of pushing Oxy as a less than 1% risk of addiction? To me, that's like a real betrayal. If there was some righteousness behind the development of this drug, for it to be used properly and for the right reason, extreme pain management, that's understandable. But how, knowing as addictive it is, how did Purdue get to the point of pushing this drug as a 1% addiction drug? And I'll give you my time to respond.
I understand. I appreciate your service, and I appreciate the question, Representative Higgins. Look, addiction, I'm a physician, right? And addiction is a devastating disease. It's a chronic, relapsing, but treatable disease. We've known, the company has known that OxyContin, like other Schedule II opioids and products, carry a risk of addiction. Science has changed. Our understanding of the science has changed over time. I wasn't present for the development or approval of the product or the creation.
How could the street know before Purdue's board knew? How could the street know?
The gentleman has asked a good question, but his time has expired. Dr. Landau, please answer his question.
Thank you, Madam
Yes.
Chair. I apologize.
That's okay. Representative Higgins, I do want to respond to your question. My recollection is that the package insert or labeling for the product has changed over time, and in 2001, it was changed by FDA to include the highest level of warning possible in a package insert, which is the inclusion of what we call a black box warning, which calls attention to the risk of abuse, misuse, and addiction specifically. It's a terrible scourge, and I'm not minimizing the impact that this has had on the population. So in essence, I'm agreeing with your concern.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is recognized. Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can. We can.
Thank you. And thank you for holding this hearing. You know, there's another book that I had the privilege of interviewing the author on C-SPAN called Dope Sick. And Dope Sick by Beth Macy documents the introduction of OxyContin as almost a miracle pain treatment, and how pharma deliberately marketed that drug to more rural parts of my state, Virginia, where the level of susceptibility in many rural clinics and doctors' offices to this miracle drug and to the very aggressive marketing and the promises of pain treatment and pain therapy were overstated, and of course the dangers of addiction understated. That book also documents the fact that there was very early evidence on the street, as Mr. Higgins said, that this had unusual addictive qualities. And all of a sudden, crime rates were up because people craved the drug. Doctors were over-prescribing it with the encouragement of pharma. And so we're not talking about criminals in the underground world seeking another, high. We're talking about people who became addicted under the supervision of their physician with prescribed drugs. I had a constituent. His son died. He was an athlete and a scholar at NYU, came here from Fairfax, Virginia, and had an injury playing football. He was treated for that injury and was prescribed for pain medicine, OxyContin. And he became addicted through no fault of his own. And that young man did everything he could. He went to multiple rehab centers. He couldn't lick the addiction. That's how powerful it is. Even those who can lick the addiction often find themselves for years in rehab, trying to kick the addiction because it's that powerful. That's why many, when they can't get OxyContin as a substitute, turn to heroin. And dope sickness is the downside of getting off it. You get sick. If you don't stay on a regimen of some kind of drug treatment like naloxone, you're going to be in deep trouble. You can't go cold turkey. Therapy here is different than with other substance abuse. And what's so tragic, Mr. and Ms. Sackler, is your family knew about this. You knew that it was too potent, and you did nothing about it as a family. You knew that people were getting addicted, and you did nothing about it as a family, other than benefit from it financially, as the chairwoman has pointed out, to the tune of $10 billion. You know, Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil. Mr. Cooper called you the most evil family in America. I don't know if that's true. I don't know that your intentions were evil. They were certainly self-aggrandizing. And they certainly turned, in that self-aggrandizement, you had to turn a blind eye to the suffering that your company and that one drug inflicted on the American people, to actually creating a crisis. And you bear that responsibility and will bear that responsibility for the rest of your lives. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from West Virginia, Mrs. Miller, you are now recognized. Mrs. Miller.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and Ranking Member Comer. I do want to reiterate the points that I made during my open statement. My state has been hit really hard with the opioid epidemic. In fact, we became pioneers on how to deal with these drug-exposed babies. The First Lady 3 times has visited Lily's place as we've learned how to deal with infants born with, they don't like to call it addiction, they call it drug exposure. Nonetheless, we've been hit so hard, and I am thankful for the efforts on the federal, state, and the local level to address addiction in our communities. And I am grateful for the progress we've made, but I cannot underscore the magnitude of this epidemic on my state and how it has not only shaped what's happening right now, but our future generations of West Virginians. Dr. Landau, what efforts has Purdue taken to educate the doctors about the dangers of over-prescribing OxyContin? And has it been effective?
Thank you for the question, Representative Miller. Although I haven't been, until becoming CEO, responsible for the commercial organization, it was my belief that that the safety and risks associated with medicines were the were presented to and discussed with physicians as part of a balanced discussion when representatives would visit with physicians. But I think more importantly and more directly related to your question, the company's been very active over the years in risk mitigation and actually played a lead role in the development of what's called the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. It was developed, I believe, and finalized at or around 2010. And in that process, Purdue, along with a number of other companies, proposed that prescriber education be mandatory in order to prescribe controlled substances, and that doing so be linked to the registration process for DEA certification. So, the company then and now feels strongly that mandatory education, because as Representative Connolly talked about in the example of a friend whose son died after being prescribed OxyContin for a sports injury, that prescription may not have been appropriate in the first place. And prescriptions start with the pen of a physician, and physicians need to demonstrate a level of competence before they issue a prescription and before medicines get into the hands of legitimate patients who might not otherwise require or benefit from these medicines.
Well, what has Purdue done to educate the patients about the dangers also of abusing OxyContin?
Well, Purdue, over time, has been a substantial supporter through public awareness campaigns and third-party education organizations, putting forward key messages related to safe storage of medicines and proper disposal of prescription medicines. We know that the vast majority of medicines that wind up in the wrong hands actually come from friends and family members. Sometimes they come from the medicine cabinet of a legitimate patient who was prescribed a medicine for a legitimate medical condition by a well-trained provider. So we've been a supporter of education directed at recipients of pain medicines, directed at school children through a program run by Everfi to get the word out to students at a young age that they need to be careful and they need to be aware of the dangers of prescription medicines and abuse and addiction in general.
Well, my next question was really related to that about, what you've done to help communities that have been negatively impacted. So you are in the school systems trying to teach the children what drug use can do to their body?
Yes, definitely. We have an active program, active support of the organization I mentioned. And we're also active through our Office of Corporate Social Responsibility, very active in supporting community-based programs aimed at education, at addiction, at recovery, at retraining, at re-entering the workforce in states like North Carolina, Connecticut, and Tennessee. Examples come to mind. Yes.
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you because I do want to ask the members of the Sackler family if they have ever visited Appalachia to see the impacts of the epidemic firsthand in my time that's left.
I have visited Appalachia, but not for the express purpose of a fact finding or what you're suggesting.
So why did you visit Appalachia?
I visited with my wife for a vacation.
Well, I really think it would behoove you to actually go into some of these communities that have just been so devastated so that you understand how the epidemic on a firsthand basis has directly affected a huge amount of people all through Appalachia. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for your very meaningful question. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, is recognized. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
Dr. Kathy Sackler, I have a question for you. According to the Washington Post, in 2001, Richard Sackler, the former CEO and chairman of Purdue Pharma, wrote in an email the following. He said, quote, "We have to hammer on the opioid abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals." Dr. Kathy Sackler, I assume you do not agree with your cousin Richard Sackler that opioid abusers are reckless criminals and culprits and the problem, correct?
Correct.
Richard Sackler also made another doozy. He said people addicted to opioids were, quote, being glorified as some sort of populist victim, close quote. Now let me go to David Sackler for a moment. Mr. Sackler, I'd like you to look at image 1, which should pop up on your screen now. Staff, can you put image 1 up? Mr. Sackler, this is your home in Bel Air, California, correct?
No, I've never even spent a night there.
But you own this property in California?
A trust for my benefit owns it as an investment.
Oh, the trust owns that. Yes, Mr. Sackler, the trust bought this for $22.5 million in an all-cash deal, according to Curbed LA from March 8th, 2018. Let's go to image 2 for a moment, please. Core staff. Mr. Sackler, do you recognize this particular property in Manhattan? This was your former home?
Yes, we sold that.
Yes, you sold it for $6.1 million in 2019. So let's just recap. You bought a property in LA in 2018 through your trust. At the same time that year, there were 15,000 prescription drug opioid deaths. In 2019, you had another property that you sold, this one for $6 million. And in 2019, unfortunately, opioid deaths went up by almost 5%. Now, Mr. Sackler, I know that people got addicted to prescription drugs such as OxyContin. I would submit, sir, that you and your family are addicted to money. Now, Dr. Landau, I'd like to turn a question over to you. It turns out that after the first round of felonies that Purdue Pharma committed in 2007, you, as the chief medical officer around that time, went to the FDA to try to lobby against them, putting in a rule to make it harder for physicians to prescribe OxyContin. Core staff, can you put up document 13 from the slideshow? At that time, you made a 2009 presentation in September of that year with your consultants at the FDA. And in that presentation, you said, in this slide, who at Purdue takes responsibility for all these deaths, referring to opioid deaths? And the answer, we all feel responsible. Now, Dr. Landau, I presume that when you refer to we, that includes you, correct?
With respect, Representative, that wasn't a slide that was presented, and actually, it was not a final slide. It was material in preparation for a
So
meeting
you
with.
don't feel responsible. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely not, is what I'm saying.
Okay, very good.
Not
Well,
what I'm
let me
saying.
ask you this. You don't feel responsible for any of that. So let me go to this question. You do admit that Purdue Pharma just admitted to committing 3 felonies, correct?
Representative, at no time in my Purdue career was
It's
I.
a yes or no question. Did Purdue Pharma agree that it committed 3 felonies?
As I said in my opening statement, Purdue pleaded guilty to 3 felonies in federal district court.
Dr.
Yes.
Landau, the CDC looked at OxyContin and said the following: we know of no other medication that's routinely used for a non-fatal condition that kills patients so frequently. Dr. Landau, I would respectfully submit that as you seek a $3 million bonus from the bankruptcy court at this point in time, that you remember what the CDC found, and you remember that you indeed are partly responsible for those deaths that you and your products helped create. Thank you.
Mr. Landau, respond?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was a question. I would like to respond. I would like to respond by saying to the representative, I've dedicated my entire career to helping patients, both through the practice of medicine and then by developing medicines and mitigating their risk. So you'd be inhuman not to feel remorse for the actions of the company and the implication of the product in so many bad outcomes. But I do believe that the product has helped a great many individuals suffering from pain, individuals who the medicine was developed for and intended for. So I'm not evading responsibility.
Your $3 million bonus. Will you forgo this $3 million bonus you're taking out of the pockets of the people that should get that money from the bankruptcy court?
Representative, I agree accountability is critical. And
yes,
as a matter of the bankruptcy, I have already willingly made significant monetary concessions in order to move the bankruptcy process forward.
The answer is no. You want that $3 million at the expense of those opioid victims. Shame on you, Dr. Landau. Shame on you.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you holding this important hearing. For decades, drug overdose deaths have remained at an unacceptable level across the United States. Just last year, we lost over 4,400 Pennsylvanians due to drug overdose. That's 12 deaths per day on average, which is 12 too many. I hope this committee and the House of Representatives can get to work on solutions that save lives and enhance the 21st Century Cures Act and Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. Thanks to these efforts and President Trump's leadership on the issue, more resources are available to fight the opioid epidemic. Naloxone is more widely available to prevent overdoses, which has led to encouraging downward trends. However, more work is needed to reduce deaths related to opioids. This includes holding companies like Purdue accountable for their deceptive tactics. Starting in 1996, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family marketed OxyContin, a drug at the forefront of our nation's opioid epidemic, as having much lower addiction risk to patients, which sharply contrasts with the reality that this drug has cost lives and torn families apart. So just a couple questions I would have for Dr. Landau. What is your company doing to educate patients and providers about the danger of over-prescribing opioids?
Thank you for the question. It's obviously a very important topic. The company has for some time been syndicating the guidelines produced by the Centers for Disease Control since they were issued in early 2016, which I fully support. We're also, as I mentioned in earlier testimony, supporting a tremendous amount of education, through third-party resources to bring to bear and bring to the surface important information relating to both the prescription of opioids, their safe storage, their disposal, the consequences of addiction, with an emphasis on children, on school children, to prevent them from their initial exposure, which can have devastating consequences, as we've heard in earlier testimony from family members who've lost loved ones.
Okay. Also, it's my understanding that as CEO, you have instituted reforms such as ending your company's use of tactics like detailing, where sales representatives target prescribers in an effort to boost sales. How would you recommend Congress work with the pharmaceutical industry to prevent opioid addiction?
That's another tremendously important question, and I appreciate it. You're correct. Soon after becoming CEO in 2017, I made a decision to stop the sales representative-based promotion of opioids. We also decided to eliminate whatever speakers programs remained for our products. What I would recommend, as part of the solution, as I understand the purpose of this hearing is intended to solicit ideas, is to make training for opioids mandatory, as I mentioned earlier. And I would also suggest that efforts be made to require all of the medicines within this class, controlled release and immediate release opioids, to have barriers introduced to make them less susceptible or less attractive as drugs of abuse. Addiction is a tougher issue. It's a complex medical condition with various contributing factors. I think education of physicians, access to healthcare are vital.
Okay, and one other thing, since you have a background as an anesthesiologist, can you speak to the effectiveness of non-opioid pain management, things like nerve blocks, radio waves, and physical therapy?
Yes, I had a little trouble hearing the question, but I believe the thrust of it is speaking to treatments other than opioids to manage pain. So as a physician and as a physician who's treated pain patients, I am a full supporter of what's referred to as a multidisciplinary approach to pain. Opioids and other pharmacologic options are one, or represent a series of options, but there are other options which, in my view, need to precede the decision to initiate therapy with opioids. And these are non-pharmacologic options: physical therapy, behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, rehabilitation, biofeedback. There are a number of modalities that are available that can be quite effective in combination with or in place of the decision to write a prescription. And I believe there are certain barriers, to patients at present, preventing or reducing access to those important treatments. So I would encourage any action that can be taken to open access up for patients for those types of therapies.
Thank you, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Landau, has any executive in the Purdue company ever spent a day in jail for the actions of the corporation?
I believe not.
Madam Chair, it's easy to feel outrage about the misdeeds of this corporation, but what about our government that gives license to this kind of corporate irresponsibility and criminality and impunity? Mr. Sackler, as part of the DOJ settlement, did you have to admit any wrongdoing or liability or responsibility for causing America's crisis of opioid addiction and death?
No, we did not.
Were you interviewed by the Department of Justice as part of this investigation about your role in these events?
No.
Do you take any responsibility for causing America's nightmarish experience with the opioid crisis?
Well, though I believe the full record, which has not been publicly released yet, will show that the family and the board acted legally and ethically, I take a deep moral responsibility for it, because I believe our product, OxyContin, despite our best intentions and best efforts, has been associated with abuse and addiction. And
yeah, you're using the passive voice there when you say it's been associated with abuse, which implies somehow you and your family were not aware of exactly what was taking place in the country. Madam Chair, look at what the consequence is of this kind of corporate recklessness and governmental toleration of it. The DOJ in 2007 let the Sackler family get away with murmurs of regret for what other people felt and so on, a mere slap on the wrist. In 2007, the department settled misbranding charges with the company, but required no admission of wrongdoing. Nobody spent a day in jail. And then documents obtained by our committee now show that after this toothless 2007 settlement, members of your family proceeded to deliberately, aggressively, and recklessly push Purdue executives to flood the market even more with OxyContin, including by targeting high-volume prescribers and pushing higher strength doses of the drug. Consider this email that Dr. Richard Sackler sent in March of 2008 to the CEO of Purdue. He wrote, quote, "I want the organization to stretch, not idle, as so much of it has for a long time. Dr. Sackler was complaining about corporate revenues as OxyContin sales more than doubled to hit an extraordinary $2.3 billion. That is the consequence of government complicity with this kind of corporate misconduct. The DOJ settlement requires Purdue now, this new sweetheart deal requires Purdue, but not your family, to set up a public document repository containing all documents Purdue handed over to DOJ. But the repository doesn't come into being until after bankruptcy is over, and it doesn't apply to documents in control of your family. So I want to ask you, Mr. Sackler, right now about the transparency that you say you champion. Will you commit today to the U.S. Congress and to the American people to contribute any documents that you have to the public document repository that's being created as a result of this settlement?
I have no problem with transparency with everything that is relevant to Purdue as it relates to the Sacklers. None at all. I think people have a misimpression through various media sources of the level of scrutiny that the family has gone through as a result of the bankruptcy proceedings and the investigation therein. I don't say that as a complaint, but I think people need to understand that a blanket commitment
Okay.
Okay.
Will you turn over the documents that you have produced to the Department of Justice?
That's a question for the lawyers, sir. But
Okay, I've got two final questions. It's been reported that members of your family talked about milking the company and then proceeded to remove millions or billions of dollars in excess profits from it prior to bankruptcy. Did you participate in conversations where you talked about milking the company and getting as much money out as quickly as you could before the bankruptcy took place?
I can't recall those specific conversations. However, I disagree with your assertion of even what milking the company meant in that context. I think it's been it is being badly taken out of context.
All right. Finally, as part of this settlement discussion, there's been the idea floated of turning OxyContin, essentially turning this into a public benefit corporation. A lot of attorney generals, at least 24 of them, oppose this idea. They want it stripped out. I would like to submit for the record, Chairwoman Maloney, a letter from the state attorney generals and specifically from the Attorney General of Massachusetts, Ms. Healy, who says that this is a perversion of the justice process, essentially to get the government involved in promoting this drug. And so I would like to submit that for the record.
So ordered. Thank you for bringing it up.
I will yield back. Thank you.
I want to really comment very briefly on your focus on transparency, that talking to many of the families, they want to see more documents. They want to see what's being held in these court decisions. And I, for one, am going to put up on our website every document we got preparing for this hearing so that the public can see these emails, the other information that we brought together. Thank you for your questioning. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, is now recognized for 5 minutes. I do not believe there are other speakers on your side that I can see on the roster here. Mr. Comer, thank you again for your cooperation and help with this hearing. You are now recognized for as much time as you would like.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to address my questions for the Sackler family. And first of all, do you all consider the doctors who prescribed OxyContin complicit in any of this? We've already had extensive questions and discussion about the damage caused by OxyContin, and not just in rural America, but in basically every county in America. Every family in America has someone they know who has suffered addiction, and the cost to society cannot be measured. But I'm wondering, do you blame any of this on the doctors who prescribed OxyContin?
Well, I would say that this is an incredibly complex problem with roots dating back long before the introduction of OxyContin. And the medical establishment as a whole and doctors as a whole are the gatekeepers of prescription opioids. These products are available only by prescription. So one has to examine that as a cause. As far as blame, I'm not here to assign blame at all. But I do think.
Let me stop you there. So I asked that question because I don't know what role doctors played. I don't know if they made informed decisions or if they were misled. That leads me to my next question. Did you ever approve a marketing plan which failed to adequately inform doctors of the major risks of OxyContin, such as abuse, addiction, overdose, and death?
I believe the record will be clear that I never did such a thing.
In 2007, Purdue Pharma pled guilty to misbranding OxyContin based on claims it was less addictive than short-term alternatives. This year, Purdue pled guilty to very similar charges based on actions that appear to have been directed by your family, the Sackler family. Your family profited a great deal from OxyContin. Do you believe opioid victims and their families have been adequately compensated for the deception perpetrated by Purdue Pharma and your family?
I would like to address that in two parts, if I may. The first part is I believe that the record in full will clearly demonstrate that the current guilty plea that Purdue has undergone was activities that the board was completely unaware of and was contrary to board instruction in some cases. So I think that will be very clear when the documents are released. However, compensation for victims is an incredibly important thing. And it's my belief that the bankruptcy process offers the best and most transparent and most equitable way to address the opioid epidemic. And I know it's been widely criticized in the media, but I think that's a lack of understanding. It permits for an orderly distribution of funds, whatever they may be. It creates a public benefit company, the first of its kind in the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, let me interrupt you there, and let's talk about the bankruptcy process. Having served as a director of a community bank for many years, I'm very familiar with the bankruptcy process, and what often happens is companies get into trouble, financial trouble, and they file bankruptcy, and then they suddenly reappear, as you were mentioning, in a new company, and they just wipe away all the debt that they have to the creditors. And it's it's not my favorite part of the law, watching companies be able to shield behind bankruptcy. So it's my understanding that your family has offered creditors in the bankruptcy proceeding just $3 billion to avoid a larger payout to victims. Is your family attempting to take advantage of the bankruptcy system to shield its billions from justice for the American people?
No, I don't believe that is accurate in any way.
Well, it would seem otherwise, and I think that everyone on this committee would disagree with your answer to the last question. And look, we don't agree on a lot on this committee in a bipartisan way, but I think our opinion of Purdue Pharma and the actions of your family, I think we all agree are sickening. And it's not just the cost to the families, it's the cost to society. Every county in my congressional district, I have 35, one of the things on their wish list is always more money for drug rehab centers, more money for help to help people and help communities cope with the expense of drugs. And this all started through OxyContin and marketing and misleading doctors and misleading patients about the benefit of your drug. I'm sympathetic to people that have pain. There are people in America that have legitimate pain and they need help for that pain. So when you say that you didn't know when you created this drug what would happen, that may be true. But what I pointed out in my question, what others have pointed out today is your company knew this, that it was addictive, that it was creating deaths, creating disruptions, creating all sorts of havoc in America. But yet you continued marketing this product. Now you've got to the point to where everybody knows the damages of OxyContin. So you filed bankruptcy to avoid the overwhelming majority of the costs that you've passed on to society. And you're going to reorganize, I assume, in a benefits corporation or however you're going to reappear and continue to profit. Maybe not with OxyContin, but you continue to operate. When I know of doctors that have overprescribed pain pills that have lost their licenses. I know of families that have lost loved ones. I know of families that have been torn apart because of what your family and your company continue to market to the American people. And it's just sickening to me. And I share the outrage of just about every American. And I'm just sick to see what it appears to me as a family and a company that's going to use the bankruptcy process to get out of this and to continue to be one of the wealthiest families in America. It's unacceptable. And I'm just sickened the more I read about the actions of Purdue Pharma. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your cooperation, ranking member, on this. And I ask unanimous consent to place in the record the statement by the Massachusetts Attorney General, Maura Healey, that mirrors many of the things that you were saying. Just a quote from it: "If we let powerful people cover up the facts, avoid accountability, or create a government-sponsored OxyContin business, that's not justice. It's offensive and wrong." I ask unanimous consent to put her statement, that's quite long, into the record. So ordered. I now recognize Mr. Sarbanes. He is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we've heard plenty of testimony today about the timeline here, that in 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to illegally misbranding OxyContin in this effort to mislead doctors and patients about the drug's risk of addiction. There was a fine. Congressman Raskin indicated that that was really just a kind of minor slap on the wrist for the company, and I certainly agree with that. But what's breathtaking here is that it looks as though that settlement and that fine that was entered into by the company was a signal to the family that with litigation coming down the road, the efforts to maximize profits from OxyContin should be redoubled. You basically went to the mat to try to pull as much money and profit from the company and from its activity as you could, because you knew that this cash cow was going to come to end. The gravy train was going to be over at some point. Just stepping back, looking at it in those very simple terms, a reasonable person cannot reach any other conclusion about the behavior of the family in the wake of that 2007 penalty that you experienced. So that was cynical. And I think, as you can tell from the committee's perspective here, we view that as really obscene in terms of what you decided to do next. So, Dr. Landau, I'm not going to ask you a question, but I do want to quote again. I think Congressman Cooper mentioned that you at one point acknowledged that Purdue was operating in a way where the board of directors was serving as the de facto CEO. So this notion, and we've heard it today from the family, that, oh, we were just following management's recommendations and so forth, is a little bit absurd, because the family had control over the operations. They knew exactly what was happening, and they were helping to push this agenda in terms of ended up broadening the addiction crisis across the country. According to internal documents that were obtained by the committee and the Massachusetts Attorney General, the Sacklers, as board members, were ordering the company, this is again after the slap on the wrist in 2007, to hire hundreds more sales reps, directed those reps to target the highest prescribers of OxyContin, push the highest strength dosage of OxyContin, approved misleading marketing materials that downplayed the risk of the addiction, rewarded employees for selling more drugs. There was one marketing campaign called Evolve to Excellence, which was designed to, quote, turbocharge sales by reorienting most of the company's sales efforts to target the highest prescribing doctors. And this would, where they would write and target sales visits to doctors who wrote 25 times as many OxyContin prescriptions. You knew what was happening. You knew what was going on. This was designed to pull as much money out of the company as you possibly could before these penalties and lawsuits and other actions were going to come at you. The company's patient saving cards, supposedly intended to expand access to OxyContin, were consistently tracked and evaluated because Purdue knew these cards were a powerful way to keep patients on opioids longer. Is that right, Mr. Sackler?
My understanding is that the patient savings cards were designed to help people afford their medication.
Okay. That's a perfect answer, because it represents the way in which the narrative that you've put together, everything that was in fact designed to take advantage of people and exploit their weakness, was presented by Sackler and Purdue as trying to help those patients. This is where the crisis originated. This is why thousands of people across the country became addicted, because of this rosy story and narrative that you painted. The Sacklers, not just Purdue, the Sacklers need to be held accountable. Before 2007, I think it's fair to say that at best, the family was morally blind in its actions and conduct. After 2007, the family became morally bankrupt. Not financially bankrupt. You're doing very well. You're rich. And that's obscene when you look at the situation of these families, this wasteland across the country that's been caused by what the family did. I hope that there will be some repercussion, some consequence for the family for its conduct. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is now recognized for questions. Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The United States is reported to consume about 90% of the world's opioids. And part of this goes back to something that was in the Affordable Care Act that mandated that 1% of Medicare inpatient payments be withheld from hospitals based on patient satisfaction. And this is something that we had a field hearing in this committee. Madam Chairman, you may have been there at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and we talked about this as part of the problem. the issue that I want to bring up is the role of Purdue Pharma in pushing this. The Joint Commission is a U.S.-based nonprofit tax-exempt 501 organization that accredits more than 22,000 healthcare organizations' programs. According to a Wall Street Journal article, the Joint Commission published a guide sponsored by Purdue Pharma on pain management. The guide reportedly stated some clinicians have inaccurate and exaggerated concerns about addiction, tolerance, and risk of death related to the use of OxyContin, and said there was no evidence that addiction is a significant issue when persons are given opioids for pain. What I would like to know from Mr. Landau is, did Purdue Pharma fund any of that research done by the Joint Commission?
With respect, Representative Palmer, I don't know. I said in earlier testimony that before becoming CEO, I was entrenched in research and development, and that would have been in an area outside of my area of responsibility. I could get back to you certainly after the hearing with that information.
Mr. Sackler, did Purdue Pharma fund any of the research published by the Joint Commission?
I simply don't know. I unfortunately.
The answer to the question is yes. There was, OxyContin was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1995, and your company mounted an aggressive marketing campaign that included a warning that the FDA warned in 2003 was misleading. Are you aware of that?
My recollection is that the FDA's warning letter in 2003 related to a single ad in a journal article.
But what I'm pointing out here is what appears to me to be a intentional effort to mislead not only patients, but physicians and hospitals. And working through the Joint Commission, which has tremendous influence, obviously, they're an accrediting organization, and that your company has heavily invested in them. They're a 501c3. You've made significant contributions through your company to the Joint Commission. And it seems to me that obviously Purdue knew that there were major problems with OxyContin, but you aggressively and I think in a dishonest way push this drug on doctors, and it only ramped up after the changes in the Affordable Care Act that made pain management one of the key factors in whether or not hospitals could get their full payments from Medicare for taking care of Medicare patients. The Joint Commission even went so far as to frame pain management as a patient's rights issue. That's disturbing. And I just want to know how much money Purdue Pharma put into the Joint Commission.
I don't know.
Well, would you be willing to get that information, or Mr. Landau get that information and provide that to this committee?
Yes, I'll take that request back for sure. Representative.
Okay, Madam Chairman, can the committee make sure that they follow up on that? You're muted.
Good point. We will follow up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that my time has expired. I would just like to conclude by saying this, that Alabama has the highest use of opioids in the country. Now, I know West Virginia has the highest death rate. When we had this field hearing at Johns Hopkins, there were plans in place to remove the pain management from the ratings for the hospitals, and I think that's been done. But it was only after we were seeing 60 to 70,000 people per year die from drug overdoses. This is an unspeakable tragedy that is taking place in this country. And I think Purdue has a tremendous responsibility here to make it right. Madam Chairman, thank you for the indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Sackler, you served on the board from, as I understand it, 1990 to 2018. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, that's correct.
So you were there when there was the rollout of OxyContin in 1996, correct?
Yes.
And I understand that that rollout occurred even as the study showed that 82% of patients had an adverse reaction. Do you recall that?
No, I was not aware of that.
In 1997, there was a memo issued by Purdue to the sales representatives. And I want to quote from this email. Your priority is to sell, sell, sell OxyContin. Do you recall that?
I do not.
Well, you were on the board. Is that consistent with your recollection of the goal that Purdue had to make OxyContin the most used drug in the world?
That was not my goal, and I don't recall hearing that espoused as the board's goal either.
Let's just go through this. Purdue set up a very elaborate system to have doctors go to Pebble Beach and be given fees for speaking, to have sales representatives trained to knock on doctor doors. Do you recall those matters that were part of the sales plan?
As a director of the company, I would not know the specific actions and speakings of the sales department.
I'm not going to go into the details on that, but there was a fundamental decision that the board made to sell, sell, sell OxyContin. Now, do you know the name of the company, Practice Fusion?
I never heard of the name of the company Practice Fusion until I was...
Purdue Pharma had an agreement with them. It was a medical records organization, and it provided a digital alert to doctors about opioids, and it increased prescriptions. In your company, Purdue Pharma gave Practice Fusion a $1 million kickback. Do you know about that?
When I was in the middle of trying to answer the first question, to say that I never heard of Practice Fusion until my attorneys advised me of it as regards Purdue plea.
I don't have much time, so I have to interrupt.
Sorry, I learned about it through the Purdue plea.
All right. There was a Wall Street Journal article that reported that Wharton, Notre Dame, and the Rand Corporation did a study that showed in states where you did your marketing program, Purdue, it was vastly more prescriptions than in 5 states where you did. Does that sound right?
Again, I didn't have that knowledge, and I don't have that recollection, but if you say so, I accept that.
These are all federal
Yeah, I
documents.
trust they're accurate.
All right. Now, your career on the board coincided with another person who sold as his career drugs. His name was Juan Guzman, El Chapo. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
In the newspaper, I've seen his name.
He was sentenced to life in prison, and Purdue Pharma pleaded to 3 felonies, yet no one from the Sackler family is in jail. Many of us think that's not right. But let me ask you this. The federal government is seeking $12 billion in assets from Juan Guzman El Chapo, the amount that audits suggest he made in the illicit sale of drugs. Do you think it's the right of the taxpayers to get that money back from Mr. Guzman?
I don't think I can give you an answer to that. I don't know anything about it. It's really illegal. I mean, it sounds...
Let me ask you this. The audit that was done of the Sackler family in Purdue concluded, this is federal, that the profits to you into your family members is $12 billion. Is there any reason you can give us why every single dollar should not be returned to the government for distribution to the victims of Purdue Pharma?
I really don't know the answer to that either. I'm sorry.
Well, you do know the answer. It's a yes or no.
Can you repeat the question? Maybe I didn't understand it.
The government is seeking $12 billion from El Chapo as the profit of his sales. The federal government audit of the Sackler family is that your family, you and your fellow members of the Sackler family, have $12 billion in profits from your aggressive marketing and sales of OxyContin. Is there any reason why that money, every single dollar, should not be returned and recovered by taxpayers for distribution to families?
I would think that you would agree that the way that such a determination would be addressed would be for the Justice Department to conduct proper investigations and procedures, which I believe they are doing. And, you know, so I think this is up to the responsible government agencies. I don't think this is something I can opine on, actually.
Okay, so El Chapo got a life sentence, and he's going to forfeit $12 billion. The Sackler family, through Purdue, has 3 felony convictions, but no one's in jail, and it has its billions still.
Excuse me, the Sackler family doesn't have a felony conviction. Purdue Pharma has a felony conviction. I'm an individual person. I worked as a director at Purdue. I'm a beneficiary owner of Purdue, but I am not, there are no allegations that have been put forward or accusations that have been put forward against me or other directors of Purdue. There were also 5 or 6 independent outside directors that participated fully in every decision that was made at the board of directors. And I think that it's including, some of the decisions you've cited today. And I think that's the status as of now.
Well, I'll let this, my time is up, but I'll conclude that your testimony is you don't know nothing about nothing. And things happen, but you don't know how. And people are responsible, but you don't know who. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is recognized. Ms. Kelly, you're now recognized. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. I would like to ask a few questions about Purdue's efforts to target opioid prescribing to seniors and patients covered by the Medicare program. The Medicare program is a crucial part of America's safety net and our nation's promise to its seniors. Millions of seniors rely on Medicare Part D to cover the cost of their prescription drugs. It appears seniors who access healthcare through Medicare were critically important to OxyContin sales. One internal Purdue document stated that the company targeted, and I quote, patients over the age of 65 as more Medicare Part D coverage is achieved. Purdue's strategy to target Medicare patients had many dimensions, and it extended to the company's approach to providers and prescribers. In Massachusetts, for example, a Purdue supervisor coached sales representatives to follow the company's, quote, geriatric strategy when promoting OxyContin providers and to, quote, keep the focus on the geriatric patients. Mr. Sackler, are you familiar with Purdue's geriatric strategy?
I'm not sure I'm familiar in detail, but what you read, I am familiar with.
As part of this strategy, Purdue made false claims about the OxyContin's benefit to elderly patients and even provided doctors with staged photographs featuring fake patients to humanize the sale and I quote, bring the heart into it. For example, sales reps allegedly told one Massachusetts doctor that putting elderly patients on OxyContin would improve safety from potential falls, when in reality, elderly patients on OxyContin have increased risk of falling and breaking the bones. Dr. Landau, you're a trained physician. Can you point the committee to scientific evidence demonstrating that OxyContin would improve safety for elderly patients from potential falls?
Representative, I'm not aware of that communication, but I can't at this time, no.
Purdue's focus on Medicare became further entrenched after instituting McKinsey's Evolve to Excellence program. Part of this plan included ranking prescribers based on, quote, value deciles. Access to federal healthcare programs like Medicare was one of the metrics used to analyze prescribers. Purdue also rewarded doctors who are high-volume Medicare prescribers under this plan. Mr. Sackler, you and the rest of the board personally approved the Evolve to Excellence plan, correct?
No, I believe elements of it were incorporated into management's proposal, which was then approved by the board. But no, I don't believe the entire Evolve to Excellence plan was ever voted on by the board in that way.
Well, the buck stops with all of you. So even if you didn't vote on the whole plan, the buck still stops with you. Between 2013 and 2017, Purdue paid the highest volume Medicare prescriber of OxyContin approximately $475,000 to switch features. According to internal communications obtained by DOJ, the prescriber was, quote, not a strong speaker or presenter, but he did engage in, quote, heavy prescribing, particularly in large doses for a long period of time. I just want to end by saying my husband had surgery, and when he finished his surgery, he was prescribed opioids, OxyContin, but my husband decided not to take it. And the interesting part about my husband is that he's a trained anesthesiologist. With that, I'll yield back.
Technical difficulties. The gentlelady yields back, and I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Desaulniers. You are now recognized, and thank you for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As bad as this has been, and I would like to remind people that Purdue Pharma is a privately held company, owned by the Sackler family, largely created by the Sackler family through multiple generations. And there's been a lot of fault on this issue. Distributors, the FDA, the DEA, and Congress. We allow for this marketing, whereas Mr. Palmer pointed out, the U.S. has less than 5% of the world population, but over 80, 90% of the use of opioids. Supposed to relieve pain, and it does, but it has also been abused. And the marketing has been at the crux of this. And it's been, in many ways, Purdue Pharma is a marketing company as much as it is a drug company. So it's so important, Madam Chair, that we pursue this. Other members have brought up the issue of justice and evil. We have to go beyond this hearing. And I want to thank all the members and the bipartisanship that has brought this. For all the damage has been done, it's even bigger than this issue. It's part of what's wrong with this country is that people think that they can ask for forgiveness, but not ask for permission and not think about the consequences of their actions. It's somebody else's fault. I became involved in this issue, like many of us do, because of constituents, parents who had lost children. One, April Rivera, has become a leader on these issues. Her son died, fortunately, in justice. The doctor who was writing that prescription in a well-publicized story on case in Los Angeles, was indicted and convicted and is now in jail. Bob Pack, the other constituent, lost a child where they were out walking on a Sunday afternoon. The family, wife was pregnant with twins when they were hit by a car, Mercedes, with a woman who was using this product. And he has dedicated himself. I, at the time, was in the state Senate, and I introduced a series of bills and worked closely with the then Attorney General, soon to be Vice President of the United States, Ms. Harris. And one of the bills simply took our prescription monitoring system and updated it so that the DOJ would have real-time information about who is abusing, whether it was pharmacies, doctors, or clients. The pharmaceutical industry fought it very hard. I couldn't get it out of the Committee of Jurisdiction, of which I was a member of the Health Committee, even though I had been promised votes by colleagues. Thanks to the Los Angeles Times, and I want to thank all the writers, people who have written books, phenomenal writing on this. They're not to blame. They are the people who brought this to our attention, and the journalists who've covered these stories. It came to my attention, it was obvious to me as I watched this up closely, that the pharmaceutical industry, and it wasn't just Purdue, but the pharmaceutical industry was determined to make sure that we didn't have that information because they wanted to continue to addict people. They wanted to continue to make money. This is a perfect business model. You had a product that would addict your clients. You marketed it to people who didn't need the product. And the physicians were told it was safe. Dr. Landau, you wrote a note that said, there are too many prescriptions being written, too high a dose for too long, for conditions that often don't require them, by doctors who lack the requisite training in how to use them appropriately. But isn't it true, doctor, that granted prior to you having the position you have, that Purdue Pharma, at the direction of the Sacklers, Sackler family members, spent money convincing doctors that there was no risk or very little risk? Isn't that true?
So Representative, yes, that's not my understanding, no.
Okay, well, the record states otherwise. So while I appreciate and believe in redemption, I'm not interested in contrition here. There's too much damage that's happened. And justice has to be met. As I said in my opening comments, people of color, poor people, do much less damage to this country and don't get to come in and say they're sorry, although I'm sure they are sorry when they're caught. There has to be justice in this case. And I hope we pursue that in this venue, Madam Chair, but I also hope that people in the Department of Justice and at the state level continue to pursue justice. Because if they don't, this is going to happen again. I yield back.
Thank you for your heartfelt comments, and I can assure you we are planning future hearings, and we need your help in doing that. The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here this morning. Documents that have been obtained through federal and state investigation are very revealing tactics used by the company Purdue to drive up sales and medically unnecessarily prescribe OxyContin and other opioids. And there is within those documents allegations and information as to the Sackler family's involvement in these efforts. I wanted to talk about some of that documentation and ask you all if you would answer some of that. Mr. Sackler, I would like to ask you about an email your father, Dr. Richard Sackler, sent in March of 2008. This is document 5 in your materials. Your father sent this email after receiving sales projections for the upcoming year, which he apparently felt were not ambitious enough. He wrote an email to the then CEO, John Stewart, and members of your family, including a witness here, Dr. Keith Sackler, calling the projection, quote, a typical lowball number, and asking the family to, quote, give me support in these matters. He concluded, quote, I want the organization to stretch. not idle, as so much of it has for a long time, end quote. Mr. Sackler, by stretch, I assume he meant he wanted to increase Purdue's revenues. Is that correct?
Well, in this case, he's referring, I'm pretty certain, to the forecasting effort that Purdue was making and wanting to get better forecasting out of management. I think that that's clear.
So are you saying better forecasting meaning more detail, or are you saying forecasting of sales meaning increase in sales, thereby increasing revenues?
No, I believe what had happened prior to this is that there had been a number of years where management had set sales targets that they had exceeded. And his desire, as I read this, is for a more accurate sales forecast. And that's relevant because it relates to the expenses that a company can set, whatever that forecast is.
Sure, I understand that. It's important as well for shareholders to have an accurate information as to that. When he says, I want the organization to stretch, not idle, what did you mean by that? Stretch would not mean necessarily what did he mean by that in your opinion?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, but I take it to mean work hard to achieve ambitious goals.
So you knew what he meant in the first part, but now you're not sure what he meant when he said, I want the organization to stretch?
I've given you my best judgment as to what I think he means.
So when he asked for support, I'm sorry, go on, sir.
No, please go on.
When he asked for support on these matters from the family, it looks as if he was asking for the family members to take the same position during a board meeting or a vote. Would that be a correct assessment of the support that he would need on those matters?
Well, he may be asking for it, but I don't know if he received it. And quite often
I didn't ask you if he received it. I asked you if by support, he meant for the family members to take the same position during a board meeting or a vote.
I believe that's what he's asking for, yes.
Thank you. Your father continued to use the Sackler's family leverage or request leverage within the company to advocate for higher earnings targets. According to the Department of Justice, Dr. Richard Sackler again opposed the proposed budget in 2010, complaining that it would, quote, lead to an OxyContin tablet forecast that is almost the same as our sales of 2009. End quote. When an executive countered that there is no basis for a higher projection, he responded that, quote, this is a matter that the board will have to take up and give you a settled direction, end quote. Dr. Landau, quote, settled direction just meant that the board would override management and set the sales target. Is that what would happen?
Representative, I'm not sure I could answer. I'm not certain I was part of those conversations, and I'm not sure what he meant by that.
Well, I'm sure you've seen these documents before. What would you take as a CEO of this corporation, a settled direction that a board would have to take up and give to you as an executive?
Well, I think just generally speaking, a settled direction means alignment or agreement on whatever the issue is in question, so that could be communicated to management.
And the board would agree on that and give that direction to management, correct?
Well, in this instance, I'm not certain. As I mentioned, I'm not certain.
Sir, I didn't ask you if you were certain if it happened. I asked you if that is what could happen.
Any number of things could happen. Again, I'm not part of that conversation.
One of those scenarios, doctor.
Potentially, I suppose.
You suppose?
I'm not really sure what you're asking me, Representative.
I think I was very clear on what I asked you, which was, in the matter of the board taking up and giving settled direction, does that mean that a board could override management and set the sales targets of the company?
I would say that is possible, but I'm not certain that happened.
Okay, thank you. Finally, a direct answer. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from California. The Vice Chair, Gomez, is recognized. Congressman Gomez. We can't hear you.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the troubling aspects of the Sackler family's role in the opioid epidemic, and there are many, is how you actively deceive doctors and the public about the dangers and addictiveness of OxyContin. Mr. Sackler, it is a scientific fact that OxyContin is more potent than morphine, correct?
Though the FDA has removed relative potency from the label, I believe at this point, I do agree it is more potent than morphine.
Thank you. With that fact in mind, I want to ask you about a May 1997 email exchange that your father had with Michael Friedman, a senior executive who later became CEO of Purdue. In the email, Mr. Friedman told your father, quote, "We are well aware of the view held by many physicians that oxycodone is weaker than morphine." Mr. Friedman ended the email by telling your father that he had no plans to correct the misconception. Your father agreed, telling Mr. Friedman, quote, "I agree with you. Is there general agreement or are there some holdouts?" A few days later, your father received an email from another Purdue executive, Michael Cullen. This is document 1 in your materials. Mr. Cullen, which is this email here. Mr. Cullen told your father that, quote, "Since oxycodone is perceived as being a weaker opioid than morphine, it has resulted in OxyContin being used much earlier for non-cancer pain." Mr. Cullen ended the email by saying, quote, "It is important that we be careful not to change the perception of physicians towards oxycodone when developing promotional pieces." Instead of instructing Mr. Cullen to correct the misconception, your father forwarded the email to Mr. Friedman with positive feedback, telling him, quote, "I think that you have this issue well in hand." Purdue, under your family's leadership, then targeted doctors with more advertisements downplaying the addictiveness of the opioid. Let's play one ad from 1998.
Once you've found the right doctor and have told him or her about your pain, don't be afraid to take what they give you. Often, it will be an opioid medication. Some patients may be afraid of taking opioids because they're perceived as too strong or addictive. But that is far from actual fact. Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted. And any drowsiness that might occur when you start to take the medication will soon wear off in most patients.
The claims in this video were clearly false. In fact, in 2007, Purdue pleaded guilty in federal court to falsely promoting OxyContin as, quote, "less addictive, less subject to abuse and diversion, and less likely to cause tolerance and withdrawal than other pain medications." Purdue paid over $600 million as part of that plea agreement. And Mr. Friedman pleaded guilty as well. Mr. Sackler, did you plead guilty in 2007? Can't hear you. Can't hear you? Sorry about that.
I did not. I was not a member of the board or had any other formal affiliation with Purdue in 2007.
Did your father, Dr. Sackler, plead guilty in 2007? Just a simple yes or no is fine.
I believe the Department of Justice investigated him, and no, he did not plead guilty. That's my understanding.
Did anyone in the Sackler family plead guilty in 2007?
Again, the same answer. I believe the Department of Justice evaluated it, and no member of the Sackler family pleaded guilty.
Yeah. And the reason why we're asking that is the entire Sackler family has emerged from the plea agreement unscathed. And this has emboldened your family to continue its false and misleading promotion of OxyContin. In the years that followed, you ordered Purdue Pharma to hire hundreds more sales reps to visit doctors. You directed these sales reps to encourage doctors to prescribe the highest dosage of OxyContin. You continue to downplay the dangers and addictiveness of the drug. And now again, DOJ is settling its case against you without holding you or your family criminally liable for the deception of doctors and the public. I believe that the American people deserve better. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen, the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes. Ayanna Presley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this important hearing. The crisis of opioid addiction has destabilized families and communities throughout the country, including in the Massachusetts 7th, which I have the honor of representing. Now, while the Commonwealth in 2014 was the first state to declare opioids a public health emergency, my constituents are still, to this day, fighting addiction and trying to heal from the pain and trauma created by the Sackler family. Despite the havoc wreaked by the Purdue Pharma, community-based recovery centers have served as critical resources like the Massachusetts Organization for Addiction Recovery and Step Rocks, who have cared for my constituents with compassion. As the daughter of a parent who struggled with opioid substance use disorder, I know firsthand that we need to invest in these support systems and in the stigma and the criminalization of addiction. People who are battling addiction are not criminals. They are not misbehaving. They are managing a harrowing disease that afflicts them and impacts their family every single day. Mr. Sackler, yes or no, do you agree that addiction is a disease?
I do, yes.
Dr. Sackler, yes or no, do you agree that addiction is a disease?
Yes.
Based on documents obtained from the Massachusetts Attorney General, this is not always your family's view, particularly when the opioid crisis was first unfolding and generating bad press for OxyContin. According to an internal email marked as document 3 on page 4, Dr. Richard Sackler wrote, and I quote, "The abusers are misbehaving in a way that they know is a serious crime. They are doing it in complete disregard of their duties to society, their family, and themselves. The notion that this is genetically programmed is nonsense," unquote. He went on to write, quote, "The fact is that many other people have the same tendencies and are not drug abusers. They are criminals," unquote. Mr. Sackler, do you agree with your father's words that people struggling with addiction are criminals? Yes or no?
No, I don't. And in the almost 20 years since this was written, I know my father has both apologized for these words and has come, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Thank you for claiming my time. In one email marked as document 2, on page 2, he wrote, quote, "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals," unquote. Mr. Sackler, who do you believe is the criminal? The person struggling with addiction or the corrupt pharmaceutical executive that has monetized the addiction?
Well, I don't believe that people struggling with addiction are criminals, though.
Are you?
I don't believe.
Are you and your family?
No, I do not.
I certainly vehemently disagree. I'm going to reclaim my time. And I also just want to take a moment to just acknowledge the equitable outrage, which I appreciate from both sides of the aisle, about this unjust, predatory practices which have decimated communities and destabilized families. I wish that there had been those same sentiments during the crack cocaine epidemic, which decimated urban communities and Black families still today. Blaming people with substance use disorder is shameful. Your family's rhetoric fuels the stigma and harmful policies that have denied people in need the resources they require to overcome their addiction. We do not need another failed war on drugs. What we need is a reckoning and accountability for drug companies who put profits over people and rob us of lives and freedom of our loved ones. You have created a nationwide epidemic. 450,000 people have died. Let me be clear. People struggling with addiction are not criminals. Your family and Purdue Pharma, you are the criminals. You are the ones who disregard your duties to society, and you should be ashamed of yourselves. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized. Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you, Chairwoman. This question line, I would like to have it go towards Mr. Sackler. Just want to make sure he's listening.
Yes, I am listening, Congresswoman.
I want to ask ask you a few questions about the effects of that involve called Evolve to Excellence. I think some of my colleagues had mentioned it. It's a sales campaign that you and your family approved as members of the board. Do you remember that campaign?
Yes, it was a management-led initiative.
Yeah, yep. You run the management. So the sales campaign intentionally targeted high prescribing doctors. In one particular doctor, Dr. One, he actually was called 290 times between 2010 and 2018. That's more than 3 times a month for 8 years. Yes or no? Is that a lot of sales calls to one doctor, Mr. Sackler?
Well, I'm not certain where you're drawing that information from, so I can't really
I'm sure it's in some of the lawsuits. This is information. Again, you targeted high prescribing doctors. You had folks call them 290 times between the years of 2010 and 2018. Purdue received 3 different reports of concern regarding Dr. One. This is a real case that between 2009 and 2011. In 2009, a local pharmacist reported Dr. One to Purdue, asserting that there were, quote, all kinds of problems with abuse of OxyContin related to Dr. One. And Mr. Sackler, just 1 year later, in 2010 report highlighted the same doctor, Dr. One, was nicknamed the Candy Man because, quote, she will immediately put every patient on the highest dose of narcotics she can. Does it trouble you that nearly 300 sales calls were placed to a doctor nicknamed the Candy Man, Mr. Sackler?
Yes, it does, because the board had put in place systems and controls to prevent such things from happening.
Is that a sign, Mr. Sackler, of an effective anti-diversion program to you?
Well, the board was never made aware of this. In fact, the board was I'm sorry, I don't mean to talk over you.
I don't mean to talk over you as well, but it's just frustrating because your words don't match the actions. The constant. I've been listening. I'm always the last person to be able to answer my question, to ask questions. So I get to listen to much of your answers, and so just bear with me in my frustration that again your answers don't match up. I fully believe you would not be settling these cases out of court unless you were in the wrongdoing. Okay, so Purdue placed Dr. One on a no-call list in August 2010. However, sales representatives were told to presume calling her in October 2011, Mr. Sackler, and they continued to do so until May 2018. Dr. One is not an isolated incident. It actually shows the intent of your company, your family's company. Another doctor who we can refer to as Dr. Two was first flagged to his abnormally aggressive prescribing practices in 2003, Mr. Sackler. And so then in 2013, the board of medical examiners filed a complaint against this Dr. Two. The complaint described the excessive amounts of OxyContin that he prescribed to certain patients. It wasn't until April 2013, a full 10 years after he was initially flagged, that Dr. Two was added to the do not call list. Between 2007 and 2013, Purdue sales representatives called Dr. Two. Guess what, Mr. Sackler? 146 times. But the story doesn't end there. Purdue sales representatives removed Dr. Two from the do not call list. Can you believe that? But still, they called him 117 times between 2015 and 2018. So, Mr. Sackler, you sat, and again, you are responsible here because you sat on Purdue's board of directors while the company turned a blind eye to the dangerous practices and worked around these crucial safeguards. Did you take any action to prevent the company's sales reps from calling dangerous prescribers like Dr. One and Dr. Two?
Yes, I believe the record clearly demonstrates that the board took a significant number of steps to prevent the exact thing that you're reading. And I'm frustrated and disappointed that they may have come up short, but I think...
I mean, frustration and disappointment's great, but I think you need to pay up and you need to really be held accountable for the fact that you all turned a blind eye or just pretended that you didn't know, but you benefited from it because you saw the money still continue to come in. The blame for Purdue's dangerous sales tactics rests squarely with the Sackler family. You know it, that's your family's name. In directing the company, the Sackler family established clear goals. They wanted more sales of prescription opioids and at higher strengths. They incentivized it for sales reps to meet those expectations. If someone, Mr. Sackler, in my district was caught flooding my district with opioids, we know damn well that they would be tried and locked up. They would be thrown into jail. So my question is, why is it okay that people like you who are directly responsible for causing a national opioid addiction pandemic, people who are directly liable for hundreds of thousands of lives lost, are instead rewarded with millions of dollars in salary and walk free? You're using our bankruptcy process and everything to walk free. People at the top of this company, including those testifying today, Madam Chair, should pay billions in compensation to families they devastated and serve time proportionally to the crisis they unleashed. That is being held accountable for deaths. These are family members, Mr. Sackler. Not enough apology or words is going to make up for it. You all have to not only pay for it, but you all have to be treated equally as anybody, again, in my district that would be doing the same thing you all just did. Thank you, I yield.
The gentlelady yields back, and at the request of one of the witnesses, we're going to take a 10-minute recess. We will reconvene in 10 minutes at the request of one of the witnesses. Recess. recognize the gentlelady from the great state of Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is now recognized. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Around the time I was elected to Congress in 2004, South Florida was overrun by pill mills, so-called clinics where anyone with cash could walk away with dangerously addictive opioids. From August 2008 to November 2009, on average, a new pain clinic opened in Broward County, my home county, and Palm Beach counties every 3 days. These pill mills caused suffering and death in my district and across the country. Dr. Sackler, while you were on the board of directors, Purdue Pharma kept detailed records on everyone who prescribed Purdue products as its abuse and diversion detection program. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you just repeat that? I beg your pardon.
Madam Chair, if I can have the time restored, what did you not hear?
I don't know what I didn't hear because I didn't hear it. I'm
okay.
sorry, I had a little trouble hearing, and there was noise in the background and I couldn't hear.
Okay, I don't have noise in my back. Dr. Sackler, while you were on the board of directors, Purdue Pharma kept detailed records on everyone who prescribed Purdue products as part of its abuse and diversion detection program. Is that correct?
The abuse and diversion program, yes, I would say, I guess.
Okay. If the data suggested high volume prescribers were abusing or diverting prescriptions, they were placed on the Region 0 list, meaning that Purdue sales representatives should not continue to call the prescriber. Are you familiar with the Region 0 list?
No, I'm not familiar with that program. The board, that program was overseen and managed by the legal department. The board did, however, have reports from the legal department about the program.
Okay, so
that's what I would know.
Well, to go through, there were many problems with this Region 0 list, ranging from a lack of timely reporting to the fact that only a small fraction of suspicious high-volume prescribers ended up on the list. Purdue even encouraged sales tactics that increased the number of prescriptions filled by prescribers on this do not call list. For example, Purdue allowed its agents to call prescribers who worked in the same practice as those on Region 0 list. Sales representatives would also aggressively market OxyContin to the pharmacies used by high-volume prescribers. Dr. Sackler, are you familiar with those practices, and don't you think they undermine the effort?
Absolutely not. I am not familiar with those practices, nor were any of those practices ever discussed or reported or mentioned at a board meeting.
Then I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to Mr. Sackler. Mr. Sackler, you sat on the company board during this time. Is it true that Purdue staff regularly provided updates to the board of directors, including you and members of your family, regarding so-called, quote, reports of concern about the abuse of Purdue's prescription opioids?
I'm sorry, it is a little bit hard to hear you. Your connection keeps cutting out.
Madam Chair, I think somebody is not on mute because I can hear everybody fine and I don't have any noise in my background. Are you able to hear me, Mr. Sackler?
I can now, yes.
Okay.
Everyone else, the staff mute everyone so that the Congresswoman can be heard with her questions and Mr. Sackler can be heard. Please mute all the backgrounds.
Except mine. Okay. Is it true that Purdue staff regularly provided updates to the board of directors, including you and members of your family, regarding so-called, quote, reports of concern about the abuse of Purdue's prescription opioids?
I don't remember those reports of concern that you're detailing. I don't remember that at all. I remember reports about the abuse and diversion program in general, but not specifically what you're referring to.
Let me ask you a further question to jar your memory. If Purdue Pharma was more proactive in investigating whatever you want to call them, the information that you were being given about the widespread abuse of your own OxyContin prescription opioid, then shouldn't you have been notifying local medical boards or law enforcement and gotten more engaged, and wouldn't that have saved lives?
I think that that's a terrific question, and thank you for asking it. The 2007 settlement with state attorneys general provided within it, as I understand it, the ability for those attorneys general or other law enforcement within the state. I'm trying to answer your question. The answer is yes, we did that. However, some states chose not to avail themselves of the data.
Reclaiming my time. I'm not asking about what others should have done. I'm asking specifically about whether Purdue should have done more to notify law enforcement and medical regulators about the abuse and the recklessness that providers that you worked with were over-prescribing your product.
As I understand the ADD program, there was a process and system in place for doing that. I believe the program over its life reported over 200 doctors to relevant authorities, and the data on Region 0, whether or not those doctors merited reporting, was available to states.
You're shirking your own responsibility here. I want to see. Reclaiming my time, Madam Chair, I want to point out Purdue Pharma actively thwarted the United States, and this is according to the DEA Assistant Administrator, that Purdue Pharma actively thwarted the United States' efforts to ensure compliance and prevent diversion. And Mr. Sackler, internal documents obtained by the Massachusetts Attorney General showed that a significant number of these reports of concern were brought to the board's attention but never investigated. And according to an interview with a Purdue Pharma attorney in 2013, the company only made reports about 154 prescribers, which is about 8% of your Region 0 database. There was a strong financial disincentive for Purdue to shut down pill mills or curb reckless providers. Taking these actions would have hurt the bottom line. It also would have saved countless lives. When the choice was between profits or people's lives, it's very clear that Purdue Pharma always chose to maximize profits. At best, this behavior is negligent. At worst, it represents a deadly and deliberate strategy that made your family rich while harming hundreds of thousands of people. Thank you for the indulgence, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Representative Katie Porter. You are now recognized.
Hello, Mr. Sackler. Thank you for joining us today. In May of 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its top executives pleaded guilty to fraudulently marketing OxyContin. Do you know how much money your family withdrew from Purdue Pharma in various transactions between 2008 and 2007?
I'm sorry, between 2008 and 2007?
17.
Okay. I believe that number is a little bit more than $10 billion, of which half or so was paid in taxes.
10 billion. Those distributions started off slowly. From 1997 to 2007, and the 10 years prior, your family withdrew a total of 126 million. Compare that to the next 10 years. 10.4 billion. All of a sudden, the Sackler family, right around 2007, started really pulling money out of Purdue Pharma. Mr. Sackler, do you recognize this message?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can read that. Let me change the WebEx here.
I'll read it to you. On May 17th, 2007, you wrote an email that said, to your family, what do you think is going on in all these courtrooms right now? We're rich. For how long? Until which suit gets through to the family. Did you write that email?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Mr. Sackler, what was the sudden urgency that all of a sudden your company went from stewardship of Purdue Pharma, taking out 120 million over 10 years, to 10.4 billion over 10 years? What happened?
Well, I believe a few things happened. Number one, we settled the legal issues that I was concerned about in that email.
Oh, wait,
in the intervening
time. Mr. Sackler, are you suggesting that you kept money in the company while you were facing legal issues and then took it out once you resolved the legal liability?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I am telling you why we did what we did as best I can recall. Which shall I continue?
Let me ask you, why should the company not transfer, why should the family not transfer back the $10.4 billion to be used to pay the creditors in this case, including victims of opioid abuse?
Well, for a number of reasons. I think the most important.
Do you not have the money?
Ma'am, I'm trying my best to answer one at a time. Would you like me to answer the money
Yes, please.
question? As I said in your opening questioning, of the 10 billion that you referenced, roughly half went to taxes. So that money we do not have. It was paid in taxes. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so you still have over 4 billion that was not paid in taxes. Do you still have that money?
We do. We still have that money.
We're spending my time under the proposed settlement that has been reached with the Department of Justice, which would be the cornerstone of this bankruptcy. How much is your family going to chip in to repay the creditors?
I'm sorry, you're considering the DOJ settlement the cornerstone of the. The total settlement offer to creditors has been valued at more than 10 billion. So that's the best I can do for you.
Okay, let me help you out. And Mr. Landau, perhaps you can ask Mr. Huebner, the bankruptcy attorney, about this. I have some questions about the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, Section 4A2. Before I came to Congress, I was a law professor and wrote this book, The Law of Debtors and Creditors. It's a bankruptcy law textbook. And UFTA Section 4A2 makes it a fraudulent transfer to remove money from a corporation without receiving any value. And we all agree Purdue didn't get anything out of giving the money away to the Sacklers. That didn't help the company, it helped the Sacklers. And the second factor is that when they took the money out of the company, what was left reasonably could have been believed that the debtor would incur an inability to pay the debtor's debts as they come due. Now, David Sackler wrote this email. Mr. Landau, why are there not fraudulent transfers in this case?
With respect, Representative, I'm not familiar with the bankruptcy code. I'm a physician, and I think there are many lawyers that have the expertise, including Mr. Huebner, who are actively working on the answers to your questions.
But you do understand that you are the statutory debtor in possession under 1107, and you have all the fiduciary duties of a trustee in bankruptcy at this time to recover every last dollar that can be recovered for the creditors in this case. The creditors in this case do not include the Sackler family.
Yes, I do. And I know that there are appropriate individuals. There's a special committee of our board working with the creditors to resolve all of the transfers made from the company since 2008.
I yield back.
The lady yields back. Mr. Comer, before we adjourn, I want to recognize the ranking member Comer for any closing remarks, and again, thank him for his leadership and help, along with Mark Sanier, with this hearing. Mr. Comer, you're now recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to say that it's good for us to hold a hearing where both sides actually agree. And I hope that we can have more of those hearings in the next Congress. Let me conclude by addressing the topic of this hearing. And let me be direct with the Sackler family. There's no one in Congress more pro-business than I am. I'm 99% of the time on the side of the risk takers. I understand that a lot of drug companies get a bad rap, but they invest a lot in research and development, and they're leading innovators. And we have the greatest healthcare system in the world because of the private sector healthcare companies that we have in America. But there are bad actors. And to the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, let me be as clear as I can be. You all are bad actors, and there's no excuse for what you did. In the beginning, You could make the argument that you didn't realize that this drug, which was possibly created to prevent pain, would become addictive and create the havoc that it's created over the past decade. But you did learn that. And you have tried every way in the world to continue to market that product, and you profited all along the way. Kentucky has one of the highest incarceration state percentages in the nation per capita. I think it is the highest in the nation. And the overwhelming majority of people who are incarcerated in Kentucky are there because of drug crimes. They've had to forfeit their assets. They have broken homes, and the cost to society is immeasurable. But you all have created the same harm to society, yet you're one of the wealthiest families in America. I hope that the courts hold you accountable. I hope that the states where you are domiciled and where you operate in the future have a watchful eye on you. And I hope that a story like this, a story like yours, never happens again. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. I just want to thank all of the panelists and thank the Sackler family for appearing without a subpoena. They came voluntarily. Thank you for your testimony. I want to thank all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their insightful and thoughtful questions. And I can assure you we will have future hearings to make sure, as the ranking member said, that this never happens again. I want to state that it has always been this committee's mission to focus on the people directly affected by the issues we examine. Since we announced this hearing, the committee received dozens of letters and submissions from individuals and families across the country whose lives have been affected by addiction. I ask for unanimous consent that these letters and statements be entered into the official record of the hearing so ordered. Since 1999, nearly 500,000 lives have been cut short by the opioid epidemic. Millions more have been caught in the stranglehold of addiction. Families and communities, as we have heard from my colleagues today, have been absolutely devastated. In the Sackler family's version of the story, they are totally blameless. A family caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They have pointed a finger at so-called bad apple employees, the FDA, consulting firms, and prescribers. In the past, they even blamed the patients, the people suffering from opioid use disorder, which they fraudulently advertised and paid salesmen to push into pharmacies, into doctors, and into their lives. So I'd like to say this clearly to the members of the Sackler family. The committee will not allow you to continue hiding from your part in this devastation. You have played a critical, active role in sparking and fueling the opioid epidemic. You approved and monitored dangerous marketing plans. They directed their sales representatives to focus on the highest volume prescribers and the strongest versions of addictive OxyContin. You targeted vulnerable populations with misleading messages. And when it began to look like your wealth could be at risk from lawsuits, you moved it out of reach, preventing the money from going to the victims of the crisis they created. We did not get all of the answers we needed from the Sackler family, but the witnesses have agreed to make additional information available to the committee and to the public. Number one, you have agreed to provide a full accounting of the shell companies owned by the Sackler family. Number two, you have agreed to make publicly available all documents in the Sackler family's possession. Let me close with this. Earlier, Mr. Cooper called you one of the most evil families in America. A lot of people agree with that. You have the ability now to mitigate at least some of the damage you caused. Please stop hiding and offshoring your assets. Stop nickel and diming the negotiators. Make a massive financial contribution that leaves no doubt about your commitment. And finally, acknowledge your wrongdoing. The families and communities whose lives have been ruined deserve at least that much. They have taken money out of the company, so it would be forever beyond the legal reach of the people they were harming. They are the Bernie Madoffs of medicine. Adjourned. In closing, without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional materials and written questions for the witnesses to answer, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can. This hearing is adjourned.
begin the hearing in just a moment when they tell me that they are ready to begin the live stream.